Welcome. This is a podcast being co-sponsored by the DC Bar Pro Bono Center and the Pro Bono Partnership. My name is Regina Hopkins, Assistant Director of the DC Bar Pro Bono Center, and I am speaking today with Jennifer Grudnowski, Senior Staff Attorney in the Pro Bono Partnership's White Plains, New York office. Jennifer provides advice and counsel to the partnership's clients on a wide range of employment matters such as hiring practices, terminations, employee classifications, and investigations. She also drafts employment policies, procedures, and contracts, and conducts trainings on various employment topics. Jennifer is a graduate of the Washington University in St. Louis School of Law, and she has been practicing in the employment law field for 14 years at various corporations law firms before joining the Pro Bono Partnership. And welcome, Jennifer. Thank you for being here. And today's topic is going to be the skinny on summer interns. So,
thanks so
Jennifer,
much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, we're happy to have you here today. I guess the first question to ask is, what is an internship? It's summer. We're all anticipating this. At some point, it will start feeling like summer, but we're starting to. We're going to have this influx of people coming during June, July, and August. So what is the characteristics of an internship?
Sure. Well, thanks so much. Before I get into that, I just want to thank you, Regina, again, so much for inviting me to be part of this podcast. And I also want to thank Stanley Augustin so much for helping out with the technical aspects. So, so great. So, of course, it's a great question. What is an internship? And, generally speaking, an internship is a program that a lot of different types of organizations use, nonprofits included, to allow mostly students to get involved in the area of study in which they're interested. An internship would, of course, provide them an opportunity to work for a limited time with the organization and learn how that organization runs. But one of the biggest hallmarks of an internship is making sure that the student learns how how the field in general is conducted. So you learn skills that can be generally applicable to other workplaces in the future.
So I guess I can understand what's in it for the intern. They get to experience in their field of study, but what's in it for the employer? Why does an employer want interns?
Sure, thanks. Again, a good question, because an intern can be a lot of work, and nonprofits are already likely overworked and understaffed, so who would want to bring on more responsibilities? But I think that most of the time, nonprofits see it as a great opportunity to introduce someone new to the nonprofit sector, and the issues that nonprofits face. And possibly and hopefully the intern will gain a passion for a certain mission and want to become part of the sector someday. I also think that a lot of people who work for nonprofits have a passion for their work and the mission of their organization, so they're excited to share that with a new generation of leaders. And then, of course, there's just the practical reality of having an extra hand in the office for a certain period of time to help out with some of the work. And we'll get to some of the proper ways that you can do that, but of course that is a part of the appeal of having an intern.
So I guess there's two things that you can do with an intern. You can pay them, or they can be an unpaid internship. I think with nonprofits it's probably more unpaid than paid. But does that make a difference in how you treat the intern?
Yes, it definitely does. And I think that the best way to think about that is to understand a little bit about the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA. The FLSA is a federal law that governs wage and hour issues. And there are many different aspects of that law that are, but one of them is the minimum wage. And so I'm sure most of you know that this means that there's a minimum amount of money that an employer can pay someone for their work. Currently, federally, it's $7.25 an hour. So the general rule is that you need to pay the minimum wage for everyone who works for you. And of course, you should note that a lot of states and cities have different minimum wages than $7.25, but generally you have to pay at least that amount. But as you probably know, every rule has an exception. And if you properly classify someone as an intern, then they don't need to be paid the minimum wage. And that is under the FLSA. So if you have this proper intern classification, then you can have an unpaid internship. And I want to just note, too, that the FLSA doesn't actually use the word intern. They use the word trainee to describe the classification that would allow you to have an unpaid internship.
So if you pay the person the minimum wage, they're an employee like any other employee, nothing really to think about there. So it's really the unpaid or intern that we have to really focus in on today.
Exactly.
And you mentioned that there are some rules that apply. Can you give us a little background of exactly what those rules are?
Sure. There's a couple different sets of rules, and it depends on where your organization is located as to what set you need to use. In Washington, D.C. and in other jurisdictions, the Department of Labor has set forth a 6-factor test that you need to meet in order to properly classify someone as an unpaid intern or an unpaid trainee. And all of the factors have to be met. So I'll go through the factors and provide a little bit of information about each of them. The first is that the internship, even though it includes actual operation of the facilities of the employer, is similar to training that would be given in an educational environment. And so what this really means is that the intern would get transferable skills and learn general knowledge that they could use regardless of where he or she would work in the future. So that might be research skills, public speaking skills, computer skills, something like that. Not all of the tasks have to be general. It is okay for the intern to learn skills that might only be applicable to a specific nonprofit, but that shouldn't be the focus of the internship. The second requirement is that the internship is the experience is for the benefit of the intern. So again, this is somewhat similar to the first factor, but the experience that the intern is gaining with the nonprofit should be useful to that intern when they're looking for future jobs. It shouldn't be only for the benefit of the nonprofit. So for example, if an internship spends most of their time cleaning out old file cabinets or filing, papers, it's probably not going to count as an educational experience that would be sufficient to qualify as an internship. And it certainly is more of a benefit to the organization than it would be for the intern. Again, that's not to say that they can never do these sort of general tasks, but those types of tasks should be kept to a minimum if you want to qualify for an unpaid internship. So the third requirement is that the intern doesn't displace regular employees, but works under the close supervision of staff. This means that the nonprofit shouldn't terminate current employees because an intern is going to come in and do some work for a little while, and shouldn't forego hiring an employee because the nonprofit plans to bring in an intern to do the work. Further, the internship shouldn't result in a current employee working substantially fewer hours than they would have because the intern is coming in. The fourth requirement is that the employer providing the training derives no immediate advantage from the activities of the intern, and on occasion, the operations may actually be impeded. So courts have held that interns are misclassified and should be classified as an employee when the employer's training consists mainly of supervision of assigned tasks. So this means that an internship shouldn't consist of an internship being assigned a task and then left alone to do it. There should actually be meaningful oversight and instruction of the intern by someone in the organization so that that intern is actually learning how they can do some work in their chosen field. And I think this makes sense based on the other factors that we've also discussed. If you're teaching someone and training them how to succeed in a profession, it's going to take time and it's probably going to actually impede from your operations because someone on your staff is going to have to be spending a lot of time with that intern and teaching them. So the fifth factor is that the internship, that the intern is not necessarily entitled to a job at the conclusion of the internship. There shouldn't be a guarantee at the beginning of the internship that the intern will have a job with that nonprofit after the completion of the internship. That doesn't mean that at some point later the intern might not come back and work for the nonprofit, but it shouldn't be a guarantee. And then the final requirement is that the employer and the intern understand that the intern is not entitled to wages for the time spent in the internship. So that should be something that's discussed at the beginning of the engagement, and the intern should understand that they're not going to be paid and that there's no expectation of pay for the work. However, I just want to note that interns can receive school credit for internships and reasonable expenses, for transportation or parking or things like that. So that certainly is permissible. I know I've been chatting here about the factors, but I also want to mention that there are other tests for proper classification of internships. If you're working in the Second Circuit, there is a different test for proper classification. It's actually a little bit more flexible than the DOL test that I just went over. It's called the primary beneficiary test. And there are 7 different factors that the court would balance in order to determine if someone was properly classified as an intern and therefore can be unpaid for that internship. So I don't know if you want me to go through them or if you just want me to mention them. I'm happy to do either.
Now the Second Circuit, that's the New York area. There's, I think,
yeah, New York, Connecticut, and Vermont.
Okay, and
so
if you're in those
circuits,
the difference, yeah.
Sure. If you're in those circuits, there's a different test for determining whether or not someone is properly classified as an intern and can be unpaid. There were a number of recent cases in the Second Circuit that where some interns claimed that they were improperly classified. And last year, I believe it was, there was a ruling that stated that rather than using the Department of Labor's test, people who work in the Second Circuit, so again, New York, Connecticut, and Vermont, would use this other test, this primary beneficiary test, where there are 7 non-exhaustive factors that need to be balanced when determining whether or not someone's an intern. And the court specifically said that no one factor is dispositive and that every factor doesn't have to point in the same direction, towards an employee relationship or an intern relationship for the court to conclude that there's a proper internship. But generally speaking, those 7 factors are somewhat similar to the DOL test, but a little bit different. So I'll go through them quickly. So 1 is the extent to which the intern and the employer clearly understand that there's no expectation of compensation. So any promise of compensation, express or implied, would suggest that the intern is an employee. Another factor is the extent to which the internship provides training that would be similar to that which would be given in an educational environment, including the clinical and other hands-on training provided by educational institution. So again, similar to the DOL, the more the experience is generally applicable to multiple workforces and educational and provides general skills, the more likely it's going to be an internship. Another factor is the extent to which the internship is tied to the intern's formal education program by integrated coursework or the receipt of academic credit. Another factor is the extent to which the internship accommodates the intern's academic commitments by corresponding to the academic year. The more it does, the more likely it's an internship. Another factor is the extent to which the internship's duration is limited to the period in which the internship provides the interns with beneficial learning. So similar to some of the already mentioned factors, if the internship is ongoing, likely it's not an internship. If it's more limited in time, it's more likely that it is. Another factor is the extent to which the intern's work complements rather than displaces the work of paid employees while providing significant educational benefit to the intern. And the final factor is the extent to which the interns and the employer understand that the internship is conducted without entitlement to a paid job at the conclusion of the internship. So again, similar factors, but the courts are a little bit more flexible in the Second Circuit and are more likely to balance the factors and look at sort of who is receiving the benefit at the end of the day, rather than other courts that are following the Department of Labor's factors, where they're a little bit more rigid.
But basically, it can be summed up that for a valid internship, it's for the benefit of the intern. They're getting some sort of educational benefit from it. And that ideally, like a summer internship, it's of a fixed duration that sort of coincides with the academic year.
That's exactly right. I think when you're kind of looking at the combination of all these different factors, that's really what it boils down to. Is this person getting an educational experience where they can take what they learned from your organization and generally apply it to the next place that they're going to work?
Mm-hmm. Now, it sounds like this is an internship is something that, some people want to have an internship after they graduate, but this sounds like something that's really supposed to apply to someone who's in the midst or somehow tied to an academic institution. And so I guess the question I have is, how important is that educational academic part of it? And is that a good tip to follow? We talked about some of the tips going forward, trying to have something that is somehow tied to the school where the student is going.
I think so. I mean, I'll also note here that some states do require that there is some connection to sort of an academic year or an educational institution. So certainly, people should be aware of that. But yeah, I think the more you can tie the internship to an educational experience or the academic year, or it's somehow connected to the institution, whether it be a college or a law school or whatnot, I think that's more likely you're going to have a valid unpaid internship.
Okay. Are there any other tips in terms of structuring an internship? I read somewhere that someone said, don't ask your intern to go get you a cup of coffee is one tip that they had.
I think that's probably a good tip. Certainly, as I'm sure you've kind of gleaned from all of this, the more the intern is not doing sort of menial tasks like fetching coffee and filing and things like that, the more likely it's going to be an internship or a trainee program that fits the definitions under the FLSA. And so, but of course that doesn't mean you can't have someone do some of those things, but that certainly shouldn't be the main thrust of what you're doing. I think that some good tips for putting together, a compliant internship program, is to make sure that the intern provides you with some sort of evidence of attendance in an educational program. That could be particularly important in some states, but I think that that's a good starting point to know that they're actually in school and involved in an academic program. I also think that it makes sense to, before the intern comes, to have in place a plan on how your nonprofit is going to create an educational experience for the intern. Is the person going to be working on a specific project or undertaking some specific research? What skills are they going to be using that can be generally applicable to the workforce? And I think you want to make sure that any productive work for the organization, like filing or those sorts of things, is more than offset by the work that exclusively benefits the intern. I also think it makes sense to assign the intern a mentor or a supervisor, someone on your staff that has the time and the desire to be available to teach the intern, provide feedback on their work product, answer questions, meet with them to make sure that they're understanding what's happening and really gaining some true knowledge of your field. I also think that if that intern is going to be working with a lot of people in your organization, it probably makes sense for you to assign like a head supervisor for that person so that they have a main point of contact for any questions or concerns that they might have. Again, I would try to allow the intern to perform limited office tasks. I would focus on teaching skills that are transferable. And I also think you should have some sort of offer letter or document that states that the intern understands that they're not getting paid for their work and that they're not guaranteed a job at the end of the internship.
There's one thing that sort of is I'm thinking about in the back of my mind, which is I thought you could volunteer for a nonprofit. That people volunteer for nonprofits all the time. So how is an internship different from just a volunteer?
I think that's a really good question, and we get that question a lot. As most people know, nonprofits are in a unique situation that they can use volunteers for much of the work that they do. And if you find yourself in a situation where you want to have an intern and you know you can't pay them, and you don't meet the criteria for proper classification as an intern, then a volunteer designation could be a good option. But there are some differences between an intern and a volunteer. Of course, under the requirements for a proper internship, you would need to provide the educational experience that we've been talking about, on this podcast. A volunteer, you certainly wouldn't have to do that. You could assign them, whatever tasks you wanted, so long as those tasks were not, sort of edging too close to the tasks that you would be asking an employee to make, and, so long as you weren't requiring the volunteer to essentially do the same work as an employee, because then you start to sort of worry that this person might actually be properly classified as an employee. But, another thing about volunteers that's a little different than an intern is that volunteers, just sort of by the nature of what a volunteer is, and of course that's someone who is doing unpaid work for your organization, mainly because they want to, for religious, charitable, civic, or humanitarian purposes, has a lot more flexibility than someone in an internship position. So, for example, a volunteer, generally speaking, can come and go when they want to. They don't necessarily have to keep set hours, even if you ask them to. They, generally speaking, aren't subject to the same types of discipline as maybe someone who is in an internship program where you can control their work product and you can control their schedule a little bit better. So depending on what you need, you might consider an internship if you feel like you need a more structured program, or a volunteer program if you feel like you have a little bit more flexibility.
So an intern is someone who sort of, during the course of their internship, you would say, we expect you here at 9, you're going to be here till 5, you're going to put in a full day, whereas a volunteer can come or they may not come, and they may do something or they may not do something, and they have essentially they're in control of their work, unlike an intern, is what you're saying.
Yes, much more so. Like you said, a volunteer can, decline a project, for example, if they just felt like they didn't want to do it, because of course, they're there because they want to be, whereas an intern, it probably wouldn't look so great if an intern said, well, I don't want to do that research project or something that may, again, they're not getting paid, but hopefully the intern is getting something out of the internship that they're going to find beneficial afterwards. Maybe it's a recommendation, maybe it's, setting up some informal meeting with people in the field that they're interested in talking to. And if they're not, engaging in the internship in the way that the nonprofit would like them to, then it makes it, much more likely that they're going to get that recommendation or whatnot. Whereas a volunteer, like I said, there's much more flexibility there.
Okay, you mentioned that this is an unpaid internship, but what if I like the intern and I want to give them a gift, or yeah, at the end of the year internship, I want to give them a gift card or maybe a little something, or maybe just
Hmm.
a stipend. Uh, can I do that even though it's technically an unpaid internship? Is that a problem?
Well, it sort of depends on how you do it. It's certainly okay to give an unpaid intern a gift, that's non-monetary. So, you take them out to lunch or, they get some sort of gift at the end, a plaque or, something like that. That's completely okay. In terms of stipend money, that again is okay to give an intern, even though they may be in an unpaid internship program. But that stipend can't be compensation for the services that were rendered to the nonprofit. Instead, it should be something like a reward for participation in the internship program. So that means that the intern, shouldn't be getting paid for their productive work. Um, so an example is that, you might run an internship program where college students come and work for the nonprofit for an 8-week summer program. And assuming that that program meets all of the requirements for a permissible internship, it's unpaid. But you're worried that you're not going to get quality candidates, for example, if you don't offer something. So you decide that you want to offer them a $500 stipend. That's okay, so long as you provide it as a reward for completion of the program. So that means that they shouldn't get paid during the course of the program. They need to be, paid at the end. And if the person doesn't complete the internship, then they wouldn't get paid the stipend.
Okay, and is there any, at some point, do I have to worry about income taxes? I mean, does the IRS care about this?
Possibly, it, again, depending on how much the stipend is, it's possible that the IRS might be concerned about it. I'd suggest that, talk to maybe a tax attorney or maybe your accountant to make sure before you engage in it. But generally speaking, if it's a small enough amount, it may not be a concern.
A token amount is okay, but if at some point it becomes like serious wages type of thing.
Right, exactly.
Mm.
And so, you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're, essentially paying them because, then if you are really close to the minimum wage but not quite there, then you might be in a situation where, um, you could get in trouble for that. So I would just make sure that it's a token amount, and if you are getting close to paying the minimum wage where you're located, then maybe you consider just making it a paid internship program.
Mm-hmm. And then finally, I guess the last question is, do you have any sort of general tips for volunteer programs? We've talked about the paid interns or the unpaid interns in particular, but volunteers in general, you talked about offer letters and sort of managing expectations up front. Any other tips you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think a lot of the tips are somewhat similar. I would say that, um, you know, you implement a volunteer screening process, for example, that's consistent with your organization's needs. I think that's going to depend on the type of work that the volunteer is undertaking. Most of the time, I would assume you'd want at least some minimum information about the volunteer. So, I would suggest a volunteer application or a resume before somebody gets started. You might also consider writing volunteer policies or position descriptions or providing an orientation that's specific to volunteers. Sometimes volunteers also need extra screening, so maybe an interview process or a background check, depending on what they're going to be doing. If a volunteer is working with vulnerable populations like children or the disabled, sometimes it makes sense to run a background check to make sure that there might not be any issues there. Sometimes volunteers drive for organizations, and it might make sense to do a motor vehicles check. So those types of, upfront procedures would be very helpful. when you're implementing a volunteer program.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jennifer. We appreciate you taking the time today to talk about summer interns as we get closer to summer. I think a lot more people are going to be interested in knowing what the skinny is on that. So with that, we'd like to conclude our podcast, and thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.